Welcome to Notepad. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. Today, we shall take a look into the legislative process of the country. And I feel that it is a good time because the whole conversation this week seems to be revolving around the parliamentary one-day non-sitting. Following the speech by the Sri Paduka Yang di-Pertuan Agong, there were no other scheduled events for that day at the parliament. And while we set aside the conversation of the democratic process of the country, we want to focus on the legislative process of the nation, and that legislative process, it seems, has not been able to keep pace following the COVID-19 disaster management by the government. The government has introduced a string of fiscal policies, including that of 2 stimulus packages, and that is well lauded by many, I guess, parties in and around the country, but the same can't be said about the legislative process in the country. So 2 authors, very prominent lawyers actually, Ambiga Srinivasan as well as Lim Wei Jiet, has penned down a very lengthy op-ed, and they published this a few weeks ago and has been seen on some other websites as well, about the kind of laws and policies that the government can introduce that is required to actually protect citizens at large following the COVID-19 pandemic meltdown. And the 2 stakeholders that they want to address, at least Ambiga and Wei Jiet in terms of their op-ed, the 2 stakeholders that they want to address is, of course, the people, that particularly those that have impacted in terms of their income being eradicated following the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the businesses. And while this show mainly talks about businesses at large and how COVID-19 is impacting the businesses and all that, we also have to take knowledge or take note that businesses are run by people, and therefore people are going to be affected as well. So if business owners, particularly the small and medium-sized companies, the SMEs in particular, are going to be impacted negatively following the COVID-19 meltdown, what are the laws in place to protect them? And of course, this show doesn't talk at all, or not so much in terms of the interests of the public at large and the individuals, people like you watching this show as well as me. This is the time for me to redress this particular shortfall of this show and try to address this blind side that I have not been looking at. That is in terms of protecting the civil liberties and the individual rights of people following the COVID-19 policies. Remember, not all of the policies that they suggested needed legislative approval. Some of them can be made into gazettes or policies. So here we are talking about many of these measures moving forward, particularly in detail. Joining me is one half of the 2 co-authors of that particular op-ed, Lim Wei Jiet. Hey Wei Jiet, thanks again for taking the time to speak with us. Let's try to understand a little bit better about the reason why you guys penned down the op-ed. It was written as an emergency legislative measure. Let's go through behind the history and the reasoning behind it first.
I think the reason we penned this is because we think that Parliament plays a very important role in trying to rejuvenate the economy, to stabilize the economy, and also to address the kind of sufferings that people are experiencing on the ground. Because of COVID-19, because of the MCO, all around the world, parliaments have convened and have passed emergency legislation to stem the negative effects of this pandemic. Malaysia seems to be the only anomaly throughout this entire world which has still not convened yet to pass legislation. Of course, certain things the executive can do through policy, but there are many other areas which can only be dealt with through legislation. And this is why we felt that we needed to pen something to give ideas to the people out there and also to those in power that these are the urgent matters that you need to address through passing legislation.
So what was interesting was that you have listed down a whole host of measures, and if I can just direct your attention, some of them you were mentioning that not all of the proposals need legislative amendments, some of them can be implemented policy-wise. Well, what does this mean in terms of getting the job done, getting the deed done? Does it mean that it doesn't have to go through Parliament?
Well, it depends on the subject matter. For example, when you talk about tax deduction, some areas you don't really need to go to Parliament because the Act itself enables the minister to adjust the taxation rates which are imposed on the people and businesses. So for those very narrow circumstances, yes, the executive does not need to go to Parliament. But for the large majority of areas that need to be addressed urgently And maybe we can discuss later, for example, having a moratorium on eviction of tenants, or giving employees more paid sick leave. Those are things which need legislative amendments to the Act itself and cannot be done merely by executive fiat.
Yeah, let's jump into it. Considering that you have raised that point up, you were mentioning that proposals to protect the people, one of them is of course a moratorium on eviction of private residential tenants. It's not just private residential tenants, to be frank, because in SS2, a story that went viral, a coffee shop owner, he just opened his shutters, and immediately he got scolded by his landlord to get out of the property. He was trying to explain that, you know, he literally just started business, but it has been, you know, he has been rudely moved out. And while I sympathize with the business owner, the landlord does have his right of way, doesn't he? Because he, you know, 3 months not paying rent, out you go out of my place, because, you know, as a landlord I need to earn rent. What's the take on that? This is a real issue that is happening across the businesses and private individuals all around the country.
So Singapore passed a legislation to impose a moratorium on eviction of non-residential tenants for a period of 6 months. So I think the rationale behind that is that, well, the law assumes that the landlord is in the better bargaining power or in the better financial position compared to the tenant. And so it must give some kind of protection to the tenant, especially when most of these tenants are like the kopitiam owners you're talking about, SMEs, or even for residential tenants, it could be university students or those from the B40 working group. These are the vulnerable communities and businesses that need the most help in this difficult time. And the law can step in to provide a shield for them, not for forever, but for a temporary period. It could be 3 months, it could be 6 months. You protect these people from being evicted. Look, we are already facing a very difficult and challenging period of time. Losing a roof over your head, losing a place where you can operate business to feed your family is something that the government should step in to protect. And Scotland has done it quite well. Of course, there must be exceptions to prevent tenants from abusing this matter. So for example, if the tenant has not been paying for the past 3 to 4 months, then you can enact legislation so that this kind of tenants don't qualify for this kind of protection. Only tenants which are genuinely and materially affected by COVID-19, as in Singapore, will enjoy this kind of protection. So we can go to the details, but in essence, that debate has to be made. A law has to be passed.
Yeah, I want to go through the list some more, but still want to hang on to this in terms of implementation and executing. Do you think it's easier for states to take matters into their own hands instead of federal? We've seen how states have stepped in and voiced their concerns about the conditional MCO. Is this one of the things that the states can actually say, you know what, for tenants and all the other issues, I can step in, Selangor government, Penang government, whatever government can actually say, you know, federal government, thanks, but we can take this into our own hands for the time being?
Well, I haven't really looked in the law in detail, but I can imagine because local government matters are within the purview of the state governments, then perhaps, you know, private commercial tenants, perhaps that is something that the state governments can regulate. But if you want a law that can be enforced throughout the peninsula and Sabah and Sarawak, obviously a parliamentary legislation will be much more efficient. There will be much more standardization and uniformity to protect the people, and you don't leave it to the states.
One other thing that you addressed is requiring time off for employees who needed time to actually address whatever personal issues that they have. And while this, of course, is in the interest of the employee, it does beg the question whether or not businesses can afford to give time off to their employees. I mean, after all, businesses have to make money, and it's already hard making money under the pandemic situation. Wouldn't this kind of things be faced, number one, met with fierce opposition by the Employees Federation, for instance? Number two, is this indeed good for the nation by giving more time off to the employees?
Well, the Malaysian Employees Federation will always jump whenever the employers are affected by in the slightest of manner. But my proposal is that, look, under the current Employment Act, those earning 2,000 ringgit and below are only afforded 14 to 22 days of paid leave. I'm just merely proposing to extend it for an additional 14 more days. We can reduce it to 7 additional days. It depends to Parliament. But my point is these people have to possibly take care of a sick family member who has COVID-19 symptoms, or they may have a child younger than 18 years old who can't go to school or who don't have a childcare provider, and these people need to take care of this of children. So yes, there's a balance that needs to be achieved, but I believe that the balance tilts in favor of the employee at this point in time, especially those who are facing very difficult circumstances of needing to take care of their family members who are sick, and they can't just go to work because there are a lot of their children who needs to be taken care of. If both parents go to work, who's going to take care of the child? Those are the kind of considerations that need to be taken into account. And if the employees are feeling disadvantaged, maybe the government can compensate the employers through certain forms of rebates or refunds for the paid sick leave that is taken. So there are measures to balance this, but I think that we need to go one step further than the existing 14 to 22 days of paid sick leave.
One measure that resonates well with me, that you have listed down, you and Amiga as well, is on increasing the threshold for credit issues, including that of bankruptcy. In Malaysia, the number varies from one estimate to another, but we're looking at around 100,000 to 300,000 Malaysians considered bankrupt. But that's not the concern. The concern is like on credit or having bad credit, and Malaysians, CRIS, CTOS, whatever, millions of Malaysians are not having fantastic credit to speak of. And what you are opining here is that you are planning to, or you want the government to actually increase that monetary threshold to rethink and reconsider what is considered to be problematic credit, or maybe extending or prolonging the need to pay back. One of the measures, and it's worth saying, one of the measures that the government is trying to do, at least in addressing this, not directly the way you say in terms of increasing threshold, but it's actually on introducing the moratorium of loan repayments. We've seen how the hoo-ha happened. Yes, okay, interest compounded, blah, 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 but okay, fine. That is beside the point. But the government is trying their best in terms of ensuring that people don't have so much of a commitment, loan commitment, repayment in the next few months. How is this suggestion of yours a little bit different from that measure that has been introduced by the government?
Well, what the government has done was to impose a moratorium on bank loans. So our proposal complements that in the sense that we are trying to increase the monetary threshold for bankruptcy. So currently under the Insolvency Act, the threshold is 50,000. So you owe someone 50,000 or more, then the other person can institute bankruptcy proceedings. We are looking at possibly increasing it to 100,000 or some other figure which is deemed acceptable by Parliament. Singapore increased it by fourfold, from 15,000 Singapore dollars to 60,000 Singapore dollars. And as you mentioned, a person facing bankruptcy, it has very deleterious effects upon that person's ability to get loan for their businesses or for their cars, and there's travel ban being imposed at some point in time. So we don't want people to go down, to tumble down that kind of path at an already very difficult point in their lives. And we think that for a certain period, for example, in the first 6 months, perhaps they can be shielded from any kind of bankruptcy action. And when the economy picks up and gets better, then maybe we can rethink whether this threshold needs to be maintained at that level. So yes, this is something that we think that the government needs to address very urgently.
The two things that I want to talk to you about that you didn't list down, but I really want to pick your mind on this, is the first is, of course, the dua kerja notion. Some employers are very strict in terms of locking down their employees by working only for them. Other employees close one eye. Other employers don't really care if you have 10 jobs on the side, as long as the one that you have with the current employer actually, you serve them well. Do you think that we need to have some form of policy or laws to actually allow for employees to, diversify their sources of income without being reprimanded or without being, taken to thrown book at them for doing so?
Well, I stand corrected, but I don't think there's any legislative prohibition for an employee to have more than one job. I think it's a matter of the company's existing disciplinary policy, which may prevent an employee from having more than one job. I think in that sense, Parliament perhaps can intervene to, pass certain legislation to say that, look, dismissing someone for having more than one job cannot be a ground anymore on the part of the employers, and that is something that, could be explored.
All right, that's one. The second thing is, of course, in the line of duty, in the process of an employee executing their work, they get COVID-19. What are the laws in place right now that protects the employees the same way you get injured, for instance, while doing your job? Are the laws sufficient in terms of giving a sound of mind for the employees to carry out their duties? I'm not just thinking about you being a lawyer and me, being a TV host, at the comfort of our luxuries. We're talking about the workmen, we're talking about the electricians, the plumbers, the TNB guys. Last night, my house was cut off electricity, the whole neighborhood was cut off. I'm sure the TNB guys actually went to some, orange zone, red zone areas in other places to solve these kind of things. What kind of laws are there to protect them from COVID-19, workman issues, and gives them a little bit of peace of mind in doing their job?
Right. So I think in the existing law we have the Workmen's Compensation Act, and I've not researched the details, but I believe that particular act provides that the employer must compensate the workman if there is there are accidents which the workman encounters during the workforce. Now, at the point at which the act was enacted, I don't think a pandemic was envisioned. So only situations where, for example, a steel beam falls upon the worker, in those kind of situations, probably it is captured in the Workmen's Compensation Act. But I don't believe, contacting a pandemic is a situation which is covered under the Workmen's Compensation Act. And yeah, you're right. We may need to relook this kind of law to see whether, employees who are facing this kind of COVID-19 symptoms and sicknesses can be compensated in some way by the employer.
All right, Wei Jiet, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about some of the legislative processes that can protect businesses on top of the individuals that we just spoke about just now. Don't go anywhere.